Chapter 19, this is our chapter about abstract and non-representational art. And these are concepts that shouldn't be unfamiliar to you as they were covered in the earlier chapters. So just a reminder about abstraction using Picasso from the last chapter we just had, the Cubist piece. Remember that abstraction is taking something that we can recognize from the world, such as these lovely prostitutes, right? And breaking it down in a way, right? Making it still recognizable, but not realistic. Where non representation is not about realistic depiction of the world around you. Non representation is lines and colors, and they're just free to do their own thing. So if you're looking at something like this Kandinsky painting, and I think the Mondrian quote here sort of backs that up, where you have to think about the fact that the lines, the color, they're just doing what they do. They're not kind of, in a sense, working to make the sky blue, right, or contour an object. So they're just existing for themselves. So that's the difference that we have to keep in mind with abstraction and non-representation. And I often hear people use them incorrectly. So again, you have to be careful about these two terms. Looking at non-representation, again, Kandinsky is really your best bet. When you're looking at the early 20th century, as I mentioned with the last chapter, you're really looking at artists who are very avant-garde, right? They're breaking the mold. And so something like this painting, there's a couple different things here that Kandinsky is really doing differently. First off, let's look at the title, where he's not using the title to explain the painting to you. Normally, when you're looking at a work of art, the title is generally pretty descriptive. It usually says, Louis XIV, right? Oath of the Horatii. It is describing to you what's going on in the painting. Here, it says to you, improvisation number 28. You're like, what? What is it? To improvise, of course, is to do something without planning, right? And the number implies that he's done it 27 other times. So one of the things Kandinsky talked about with non-representation is that often when he would sit down to perform a painting, that he wasn't really thinking about where he was going with it, that he would just allow the painting to emerge from his unconscious mind. So, if you go back and look at surrealism, there's some connections there you can make. But that he wasn't, in a sense, planning the painting out. He wasn't thinking about representing something, so he didn't have to do this sort of background work to set up the subject. There is no subject in the clearest sense. The subject is color and line and how they're interacting together on the canvas. However, my students, often with non-representation, they still search for meaning. So they might look at this painting and say, oh, but I see a castle on a hill. I see a pair of eyelashes. I see a fried egg. That one's my favorite. But none of those things are there. Kandinsky would say, non-representation is not about that, but look how hard it is to overcome the need that humans have for realism or representation. That's what Kandinsky thought non-representation was really fighting, was that why is painting about representing objects and representing subject matter? Just let it be its own self. Let it be painting, right? Let it exist for its own reasons. This is the one that's in your text. I don't think it's quite as good as an example as the one I showed you previously. But again, this is the one that shows up in the textbook we're using right now. So again, definitely take a look at that as well. Also want to talk to you about Suprematism, which was a movement that was occurring in Russia in the early 20th century, was impacted by the Russian Revolution, and also concerns itself with non-representation. Probably the best known suprematist is Kazimir Malevich. And this is a shot of his paintings in this futurist exhibition. It's not really truly futurism as you see described in your textbook, the Italian movement. They're using futurism here kind of as a different type of word. So don't make, that mistake. But I wanted you to see Malevich's paintings together as a group. This is a black and white photo, unfortunately, so you don't get to see the color, right, of the painting. So I'll touch on that in a minute. But you'll notice all of them are just simply shapes and forms. Just like Kandinsky, he is not using any type of subject matter. Here is a photo of the Pompidou Center in Paris, where, again, we're seeing a color photograph here. So we're able to see the color of the pieces and think a little bit about color. So with color, he talked about how he thought color could imply mood. So to him, shapes, colors, right? They could communicate something about how we feel as humans, how we our sort of reactions or emotions without actually real subjects. So he was very well known for that. This is the composition that's in your textbook. Again, not really one of my favorites, but wanted to make sure I mentioned it because that's what you'll see as you're reading. I don't really like showing ones where it's about a subject. And you'll notice here it's like he's in an airplane looking down at the world around him. To me, that's more abstraction, not non-representation. So, I try not to cloud these things, but your book kind of does a little bit. So notice that art's never easy, I would say. And this is another piece that's in your textbook by El Lissitzky. And it actually has a political meaning behind it, which shows you that non-representation can often be political. For being something that's not about subject matter, how can you make this work, right? Well, this piece deals with the Russian Revolution, and you have the idea of the Reds, right, and the Whites, right, the Bolsheviks and the revolutionaries fighting against one another.